Betsy Wilkening, and I'm from Tucson, Arizona, and I'm from Wilson K-8 school. I teach 7th grade science and also an engineering robotics class to 7th and 8th graders. So I was on the Ocean Atmosphere Sea Ice and Snowpack Expedition, which is a mouthful, or OASIS for short. And I was up in Barrow, Alaska in the spring of 2009 with a group of over 40 scientists from around the world, basically looking at how different compounds move between all those mediums. It was pretty amazing flying into Barrow because the plane comes in over the sea ice, and I'd never seen sea ice before. So, coming from Tucson, the coldest I'd ever had for temperatures besides training in Fairbanks was just the refrigerated section at Costco. So one of the things that I did when I was in Barrow was atmospheric research, and we were looking at a lot of pollutants because up in Barrow they get a lot of the stuff that comes out of our tailpipes further south because of long-range transport ends up in the Arctic. And so I was able to write a grant, and I got equipment for a project called Global Ozone Project, and we have an ozone monitor that monitors tropospheric ozone, which is a pollutant, right outside my classroom. And it's been a really cool project with my students because now they're like atmospheric scientists also. Plus, part of that project is, since it's global, we have schools around the world that have the same equipment, and there's a social networking site. So my students lately have been blogging with another group of students in Brazil and learning about Brazil, learning about environmental issues there, talking about global environmental issues. So it's really given my students a voice, not only in learning the science, but in also talking to their peers around the world and discussing these scientific issues just like scientists would do. And all of that came out of starting to do my own atmospheric research and working with these scientists up in Barrow. So since PolarTREC, I've been able to do a lot of stuff. I went to the International Polar Year Conference in Oslo and met up with a group of teachers internationally, of whom I'm still in contact with a lot of them and working with them, sharing things between my classroom and the classroom in Switzerland, classrooms in Alberta, classrooms even in California, and did stuff at the International Polar Year Conference in Montreal. And a real exciting part of that conference in Montreal is we're making an official organization now called Polar Educators International. And I'm part of the council for that and helping design the website for that. And we've got just an incredible amount of really energetic and really awesome teachers and different types of educators and scientists involved with us from around the world that are trying to tell the story of the polar regions and educate others about the polar regions. Some of my students couldn't imagine being somewhere as cold as I was, but I've gotten words back from other students who, in middle school, they're not as totally excited about the future and excited about science all the time, but I'm starting to hear back from students as they're looking at going to college or moving on to college, and they've taken the time out to get back to me and say, you know what, I'm going into engineering, which is my background, or I'm going to study science, and I never liked science before I walked into your classroom. So it's really extra special because the students are taking the time out of their day to go back to somebody they knew 4 or 5 years ago and really thank you, and that just makes it worthwhile to be a teacher. PolarTREC has truly transformed my life. I've thought about things in a totally different way. I've become more of a global educator, looking at global issues and things involved with our environment, not just at home. One thing that amazes me now is that when I ask my students, I'll ask them at the beginning of the year, why do the polar regions matter? And towards the end of our unit on the polar regions, they can really pinpoint that actions they do in Tucson affect the polar regions, and things that happen in polar regions affect them in Tucson. And they've made that connection, and it's awesome what PolarTREC has done to enable them to do that and enable me to do that as a teacher.